All right, everybody. Good afternoon. Let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome into the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. Thanks for joining us today here in the SCCU Daily Planet Theater, or for joining us online if you're watching on the museum's YouTube channel. My name is Chris Smith, and I am the host for the Lunchtime Discovery Series. Every Wednesday at noon, we gather here in the museum's Daily Planet Theater and online to meet interesting people who are doing interesting things out there in the worlds of science, nature, education, art, and more. And today we've got a great program for you, of course, as we do every single week. Now, the Lunchtime Discovery Series is coordinated by the folks who run the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education, which is a part of the Department of Environmental Quality, a sister government agency to us in the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, wherein the Museum of Natural Sciences sits. So, working together, we've got just a tremendous network of amazing people who are learning more about what is happening in the world around us. And most of the time for this presentation, our special guest speakers come to us from pretty close to the museum. Most of them are from somewhere in North Carolina, and they share with us their stories and insights and knowledge about things that are going on in North Carolina, which I think we're going to do a little bit today. But for today's presentation, I'm very excited because our special guest speaker works here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. Dr. Bronwyn Williams, here with me on stage, is our research curator for non-molluscan invertebrates. You'll learn more about what all of that means if you're not sure already. And is curator of the herbarium and does some amazing research, most often covered in mud. So, please put your hands together and welcome to the stage, Dr. Bronwyn Williams.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to start off with a little quiz. You're not going to get graded, but first question for you, how many of you know what a crayfish is? Okay, crayfish, crawdad, mudbug. Okay, how good are you at identifying crayfish? Not the species, but just saying you picked something up, you know that's a crayfish, right? Pretty good? All right, I'm going to test that. Gladiator style. Crayfish, thumbs up. Not crayfish, thumbs down. What do you think? Seeing mostly thumbs up. This is a crayfish. This is Cambarus hobzorum, the Rocky River crayfish, which occurs primarily in the Petey River, Rocky River, that's found east, kind of north to east of Charlotte. It's a North Carolina endemic. Well, okay, Carolina's endemic. It just gets across the border into South Carolina by a couple miles. All right, ready for the next one? Crayfish, not a crayfish. All right, excellent. Thumbs down. Yep. Does anybody know what this is? Yes. It is a shrimp. Do you know what kind? It's a snapping shrimp. Do you see that big left claw? So they use that basically to create cavitation bubbles, these little explosions that they use to basically break into their prey. Okay, good. You guys are doing really, really well. Crayfish, not a crayfish. All right, I'm seeing kind of mixed here. Mostly down, mostly thumbs down, a couple thumbs up. Anybody want to take a guess? It's not a crayfish. You want to take a guess as to what it is? Yes. It's not a crab. This is, yes. Either one. You are close. This is a squat lobster, which is actually not a true lobster. In fact, it's an anamurine. So it's in that same group that hermit crabs and mole crabs are. Kind of cool, huh? All right. Crayfish, not a crayfish. All right, I'm seeing sort of mixed things here. This is not a crayfish. Can anybody tell me what it is? It is a lobster. So this is crayfish kin, okay? Basically the closest relative to the group of crayfishes. This is an American lobster, a clawed lobster. So when you eat lobster on the coast, usually as you move towards the northeast, this is what you're getting. All right, crayfish or not crayfish? This is a crayfish. All right. This is Cambarus asperamanus, the mitten crayfish. Can you see kind of the furry claws? Kind of those long CD on those claws? So this is actually found up in the mountains of North Carolina and South Carolina. So pretty cool. Crayfish, not crayfish. I know you guys are getting tired. This is tough, but which? We're getting towards the end of this. This is a crayfish. This is Procambarus rainii, the disjunct crayfish. This is found in north central Georgia, gets just across the Savannah River into northwestern South Carolina. So not here in North Carolina. Crayfish or not crayfish? Nope, not somebody I know, but for context. This is the world's largest crayfish. This is called the Tasmanian giant freshwater lobster, or crayfish. This is also the largest freshwater invertebrate in the world. So yes, a crayfish. Two more. So this is the second to last one. Crayfish or not crayfish? Oh, you guys are good. Not crayfish. Anybody know what this is? I did not when I started this job. I found one of these in the collection and I thought, what the heck is this weird looking not crayfish? This is called a lobsterette. This is actually an entire group of clawed lobsters. So distantly related to that, sort of Atlantic, that lobster that we eat. All right, last one. Crayfish, not crayfish. Okay, split here. This is a crayfish. As weird, because it has 3 legs, 3 pairs of legs. But how many pairs of legs do you think crayfishes have? So they're all in the group Decapoda. So you've got your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Deca got 5 pairs of legs. So, but yes. You nailed it. All right, this is a really cool, weird crayfish. This is actually a cave-specific crayfish. It's called the northern spider cave crayfish. It's the only species in this genus. It's found in northern Florida. Okay, well done. But we can tell, crayfishes basically display a whole variety of shapes and sizes and colors. Color patterns, right? Pretty much everything that I'm showing you of the 20 species here you can actually find in North Carolina, the exception of one. Yes. Talk about the what? Okay. Okay. So we have this sort of wide variation in kind of the morphology of crayfishes and how they look. This is kind of another little test, so feel free to kind of shout out with this, but where do you expect to find crayfishes, right? Does this look like good habitat? Yeah, right? Swamps, kind of wetlands, streams, rivers, creeks, lakes. For those of you that know, that's Lake Phelps in the middle picture there. How about this? Would you expect to find crayfish here? No? Why not? So the water's dirty. You wouldn't expect to find crayfish in here, but you do. So kind of some of these ephemeral little ponds and these ditches that hold water, even though they're really, really silty and muddy, we find crayfish in them. Okay, how about this? Off the side of highways, roads. Doesn't look that wet, does it? Crayfish? No? All right, some of you say yes, some of you, why no? If you say no, why no? So there's no water to let them live. That is very true, but put a pin in that for a sec. All right, yes, if yes, why? Rocks? No rocks. There are no rocks in these areas. I mean, this is just kind of like grass, the grass off the side of the road. Yes. There's water. Yep, you're onto something here, so we'll get there. Here's the answer. Yes, you find crayfishes on the sides of roads in these sometimes, dry ditches or just little ephemeral wetlands and such. Little ditches, but not ones that have water in it, like that one that I showed you, the muddy ditch. So, you can find them in ditches for sure, certain times of the year, yes. Okay, how about prairies? Would you expect to find crayfish in prairies? Just grasslands? No, we do. Okay. How about forests in the woods? Yeah, no water around, right? Yes? All right. You guys are good. So what is it for these last ones that are not permanent water bodies? What is it that we're looking for when we're actually looking for signs of crayfish, right? Like we're not just wandering around and a crayfish is up, usually. Sometimes this does happen. Crayfish is not sort of wandering around on the ground there. We're not just stumbling across little holes in the ground. Does anybody know what keys us in to a crayfish being there? Yes. Sometimes damp, sometimes not, but basically water's, maybe not. But yes. So where else, if there's not water on the surface, okay, if we're not actually seeing water, is there water somewhere? Yes, where? Underground, groundwater, right? So for those of you guys who get your water from wells, right, you're digging down below the surface and you're tapping into that groundwater, right? So that's a permanent water source for these things. So here's what we're looking for. They're called chimneys. I think that's what you were trying to get at with these, basically these piles of mud, right? So there are certain crayfish species that will spend almost their entire life cycle away from what we consider permanent water bodies. And as they dig down into the ground and create these burrows, they're pushing up, kind of like with snowballs, they're pushing up these pellets of mud that they use to create these chimneys. And the chimneys are pretty cool. So we don't exactly know what their function is, except for the fact that we think, bigger crayfish have a bigger chimney, could be a dominance thing. But it also, a lot of these burrowing crayfish species have multiple entrances to their burrows. Only one has a chimney, and that height differential is really cool physics-wise. It actually draws air into the chimney entrance and then out of one of the non-chimneyed entrances. So they are little ecosystem engineers that are actually creating their own airflow in this really kind of low oxygen environment. Yes? What does what mean? Sorry, say it again. Dominance? It means I'm bigger than you, I can beat you up, I'm going to take over your space. Yeah. I guess not always a bigger person, but essentially like I'm going to assert dominance over you, I want your chair, so get out there, Oh, anyway, I wouldn't do that. Okay. All right. So that video I took in Western Kentucky in an old farm field, and I mean, there were just chimneys everywhere, right? So this was us, because we couldn't help it. We were doing a survey. We started digging. All right. So now what happens when you dig down, like how do we get these things out of their burrows, right? So some of these crayfishes can be many yards below the surface. I mean, so I have a 10-foot length of chain that I use to gauge how deep these are. Some of these burrows, I could drop the chain and lose it. Didn't hit bottom. But once we kind of entice the crayfish up to the surface and we dig out a little bit of kind of, space that we could put our hand in, whatever, what are we seeing? All right. There it is. So the burrow, it just kind of climbed up out of that burrow. And here I am trying to hold the phone with one hand and grab the crayfish with the other and not drop the crayfish or the phone into the wet hole. And yes, those are millipedes floating around in there. Yes? Every so often. For the most part, they're trying to kind of,
What was the question?
Oh, sorry, do they ever try to bite or pinch you? Yes, and every so often, if you get on the working end of it. But for the most part, when you reach down in the holes, you're almost kind of palming them, and they're trying to get away. But yes, every so often, you're surprised. So yes, crayfishes are kind of everywhere, right? Do you guys now kind of think about, if you walk out into nature, you're going to start looking in places that you never did before for crayfishes, right? Pretty cool. Yes. All right. That was awfully muddy. Let's get washed off a little bit before we move on with this. I can tell you, when we work in ditches that have no water, it's pretty awful driving away just coated in mud, not having a way to kind of wash that mud off. What if my whole body is covered in mud? That has happened before, and I have stopped at a rest stop on the highway, and I think people thought I was nuts. So, yeah. Okay. So all of this background is context to talk to you and tell you about a big project that we're currently working on, which is this. So it's a multi-state, yes. Do I ever clean out my car? Well, good news is most of the time I get to use state vehicles. And yes, I'm one of the few people that cleans out the state vehicles, so I know where the vacuum is, and I am able and willing to use it. And I've even power washed the vehicle, so I'm not sure all of my colleagues can say the same thing. But yes, very muddy. Okay, so this January we started this very ambitious project that, in large part, one of the major goals was actually trying to do an extensive survey of the coastal plain, crayfishes of the coastal plain in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, okay? And this is basically kind of this massive try to capture all the crayfishes, the entirety of the crayfish diversity kind of in this area. Now, from everything that I just showed you, that's a lot of work, right? We're looking for a lot of different things in a lot of different places. So yeah, it's a little daunting. But why the coastal plain, right? Why did we get this project to work on the coastal plain? Well, coastal plain areas in general and coastal plain freshwater areas are kind of some of the most endangered or in peril in general. And why is that? So you've got saltwater inundation, sea level rise, kind of coming from the coastal area east kind of on up. You've got all of this upstream kind of input that's flowing from the mountains or some of the Piedmont down into the coastal plain. You've got urbanization kind of in various areas, forestation, all sorts of kind of various impacts. But also the coastal plain is really difficult to sample. So we don't know a lot about the crayfishes in this area, right? I mean, you kind of walk up to a swamp, where do you even start, right? And also, I can tell you, not a lot of people go after burrowing crayfishes because it takes a long time and a lot of effort to actually get after them. So, and along those same lines, we're trying to figure out, okay, what is this diversity, right? What is this native diversity that we have on the landscape, right? What's a species? Coastal plain has some really cool crayfishes, but they are really tough to tell apart, even for the experts. So they've been largely untouched. And I want to give you some examples. Do you think these are different species or the same species? They are different, but boy, oh boy, are they hard to tell apart when you're in the field, if you don't know what you're looking at, where you are, okay? Different species or the same species? So for a long time, these were all considered one species. And in fact, most of them still are, but we know they're all different. So we've used, a bunch of different data points using genetics, as well as behavior, and so on and so forth to talk. So you are right, different, but it's also the same. Different or the same species? Different? So this is actually the same. So earlier this year, we published a paper that sort of sank that on the right, basically found that it was genetically and morphologically identical to the one on the left. And that was kind of important for conservation work. Okay, but I'm throwing the word around species a lot here. But yes? It does look like a smiley face on that one's tail, yes. They are pretty cool. So this is now the Cedar Creek crayfish, which is found in South Carolina and North Carolina. All right, so what is a species? So that's kind of this, yes, you want to tell me what a species is?
The same animal, but a different animal of the same animal.
Yeah, same but different. That works for sure. But basically, it's kind of sort of the idea of defining species is kind of equal parts biological and philosophical. I mean, I could have an entire seminar on defining what a species is. I could have an entire seminar series on defining what a species is. What does philosophical mean? Wow, okay. That is a great question. We can probably give you a philosophical answer to that. Deep thinking with no real answer. So basically we could argue, think about this, that we could argue back and forth, like, why do you think this is a species? And I say, I don't agree with you. I think it's this. And we just can have these fun arguments. So that doesn't define philosophical per se, but kind of what I'm getting at here. Okay. We should chat more, definitely. I think the philosophical side of things, you're going to help out a lot. Okay. All right. For us, I'm going to define what a species is here, because this kind of matters for why we do this conservation work and how we do it. All right? For us in the crayfish world, a species is a group of crayfish that can be distinguished from other groups of crayfishes, right? You're same but different, based on a preponderance of evidence. All right? So in other words, a species is a group of crayfish that differs from others in its morphology, color pattern, behavior, habitat association, biogeography, genetics, symbiotic communities, and/or any other characteristics that we might be able to discern. So we don't need all of those lines of evidence, but it's basically as we start to add these together and they kind of say, these things are not quite the same, that's what a species is. And why is the concept of species so important? And this is critical when you think about kind of management and conservation. So we cannot manage something that does not have a name. Okay? So I can tell you, kind of one of those past slides where I said, yeah, some of these are still considered the same species and some of them have been split out before. Well, if it hasn't been named, all those ones that are lumped together right now, they get managed as one. So does that make sense? That's why this is so important, is that sort of a species is the actual critical foundational aspect by which we kind of enact conservation and can do management and conservation. Okay, let's get back to this big project. All right, so how are we taking this concept of species, right, that I've just shown, and how do we take that into how we survey, how we do this project, right? How are we actually doing this to figure out how many species there are on the landscape? So you see that upper map there that has all those little broken up polygons, shapes in there? Okay, there are 366 watersheds. Each one of those is a watershed. And we are sampling the snot out of them. Yes?
It looks like on the green, it looks like the mouth of a dinosaur, little arms and then one.
It does. I'm never going to look at that map ever again. So we pointed out that basically kind of the green part of the map looks like a dinosaur with little arms and kind of the head and such. And okay, I'm going to have to change our study area slightly to get rid of that shape, I think. But good point. Thank you. Okay, so what are we doing? We've used these watershed boundaries to basically say we're going to sample at least 2 sites in each one of those polygons, so that's a total of 766, if I've done my math correctly, sites, at minimum, and at each site, because again, go all the way back to all those different habitats that crayfishes are found, at each site, we're essentially saying, is there a stream here? We gotta sample the stream. Okay, floodplain, we're gonna sample the floodplain. Ditch, we're gonna sample the ditch. Okay, is there a wetland that we just drove by over here? We're gonna sample that ditch. So it's a lot of work. And we have an amazing group of folks to do this, that we're doing this with. So we got North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, we've got South Carolina DNR, we've got Georgia DNR, we have West Liberty University, which is based out of West Virginia, we have Georgia Southern University, and sort of other folks that are interested and want to help with this. And we are really trying kind of to cover this as well as possible. And how are we doing it? And to have fun doing it, right? So we're in the streams, right? We're kicking around, taking nets. We're in pretty streams. We're in not so pretty streams. We use traps and sometimes get organisms in our traps that we don't want to be in the traps and then have fun trying to release them. That is a water moccasin, a pretty big one, if anybody kind of is, and that was pretty fun to release. We spend a lot of time staring at crayfishes on the bank. We dig a lot in all conditions and in all places. This was February in South Carolina, very cold. It's down in Georgia, and this is our Wildlife Resources Commission folks. And sometimes we give up digging and we just try to plunge. So they do make these Yabby pumps, if you've ever seen that they're made for scuba diving, and it's like a little reverse water gun that you can suck stuff up in. And this is kind of a homemade version of that we can dig out a little bit, shove it down the hole, and then try to use suction to get, hopefully, the crayfish out of the hole. All right. Yes. Do other things live in crayfish holes? Yes, they do. All sorts of little microscopic organisms we'll find down there, springtails and little worms, other various insects and such. There actually is a group of leeches that I'm working on that actually sort of is symbiotic, like lives at the entrance of crayfish burrows. There are some frogs that turtles make use of crayfish holes. I'm sure I'm missing things, but yes, they are entire ecosystems in themselves. Yes?
Do fruit flies live there?
Do fruit flies live there? I have yet to see one, but you have a question?
Can other animals get in the hole when the crayfish is out of the hole?
That is a good question, and the answer is they probably could. One thing that I missed was Massasauga rattlesnakes up in, so there's some snakes, but I don't know. So crayfishes will leave their burrows, but maybe not for long enough for things to, unless they accidentally fall in there, go and go. This is a good place to be. Now, that said, in Georgia, we actually had a student who dug into a burrow and found an Amphiuma, which is a legless lizard. Amphibian, sorry, thank you. Yes, legless amphibian, that thing. You can tell I don't do vertebrates. But I'm always here to learn. Anyway, pretty cool. So she was able to get that out, reach back in, and the crayfish was in what she called a little library nook, kind of not to the other side. Now, Amphiuma will eat crayfish. So now whether that Amphiuma had gotten into the burrow and we just disrupted its snack or its meal, I don't know. But that was kind of a neat find. Yeah. Did that answer your question, sort of, kind of? Okay. All right. So how well, oh, yes. What was the most crayfish that I caught? In one spot? Whew. We're actually going to get to that towards the end of this talk. So hold on to that. Hope if I don't answer it, remind me. All right. So this project is nearly a year in. How well have we done? I think pretty well. So a lot of sampling. So each of these dots is a site that we've hit where we found crayfish. The little X's are sites where we just sampled the snot out of that area and didn't find any crayfish. That's also useful information. So we still have a lot of work to do, and you might be able to see North Carolina is probably kind of the least sampled area so far. And part of that has been, I've been down in Georgia quite a bit. But it's been pretty cool. Okay, so I'm come back to this. Oh, yes.
What do crayfish eat?
What do crayfish eat? Almost everything. Anything they get their little claws on. So, yeah, they don't eat people. That sounds like a horror movie. Yeah, no. Huh? We are animals, but we're a little too big for them. So yes, they'll eat sort of aquatic insects and worms and little fish and fish eggs. They'll forage on algae and leaves and such. So they're grazers, kind of anything that's easy and accessible. Like cows? They graze like cows? Same but different. Okay. All right, so I'm going to move into kind of what the abstract of this talk was, which is actually the second part of this project. So sort of the first major goal of this is to really sort of survey and sort of figure out what it is that native biodiversity of crayfishes throughout the coastal plain of this area. But what else can we actually discern while we're in this area? What are the threats to these native crayfishes, right? So I kind of hit on some of these already, right? Regional issues, so you think saltwater inundation, sea level rise, you've got climate shifts, urbanization, particularly along the coast. But we're also interested in current and future threats at more local scales, okay? So things like chemical and other pollutants, agricultural runoff, industrial runoff, hot spots, literally hot spots in the streams from kind of industrial activity, habitat destruction and modification, or sedimentation. And why should we care about sedimentation, particularly when you see all these muddy ditches and stuff, right? Well, high sediment loads mean that all of that dirt, that mud, kind of all those particles of earth that are floating around in the stream, they actually will build up in the cracks and crevices and holes that crayfishes use to hide, right, to shelter. So you lose that ability to shelter, and also it actually impacts the ability of the crayfishes to breathe. So crayfishes they breathe they have gills that are tucked inside that shell in the front. And so if that water that's kind of coming in is all just packed full of all these particles of dirt and dust, that's all going to basically pack into their gills as well. So sedimentation, not good. Okay, but this all said, there's another serious threat that I haven't yet mentioned. And that's the introduction and spread of non-native crayfishes, right? So this is like crayfish battle, crayfish on crayfish, there can only be one. And this is what I want to talk about kind of for the remainder of this, the very short remainder, and I have kind of left this pretty short, kind of more discussion-y. Okay, I want to give you 3 case studies where kind of these non-native crayfishes, well, we'll leave it there. Let's move into that. Okay. This is Cambarus aldermanorum. So this is the needle-nosed crayfish, which was described from sort of South Carolina, just south of Charlotte, about a decade and a half ago. Okay. It has this weird distribution where we've got this tiny little population that's up in the Johns River. So any of you guys have kind of been up in that really beautiful area of the Blue Ridge, you may come across this. And so we were wondering, like, what is this? Did people just not sample thoroughly between kind of the core area of this distribution or not? What's going on? Well, over the last 6 or 7 years ago, we've actually been doing a lot of genetic work as well as surveys, and the surveys basically show that no, this species does not occur in that area kind of between those 2 big populations. But the genetics shows that, well, initially, I guess I should jumping ahead here, that population up in the mountains was different, so genetically distinct from kind of where this species was described in South Carolina. But through our surveys, we were actually able to extend the distribution of what we're calling the needle-nosed crayfish up into Union County and discovered that's actually a different species. So we've got 2 things now that are currently called Cambarus aldermanorum, only one of which retains the name. And we happened to actually discover that second one through this population that's up in the Johns River, which happens to be an introduction from kind of this. So we actually use that introduction. We were able to actually designate that an undescribed species. We have not described it, and we will not describe it from the Johns River, but yeah. So that's kind of an interesting thing of we didn't know what this thing was. We didn't know the status of it. Okay. So that was it's all good. Oh, no, it's good. All right.
What does biodiversity mean?
What does biodiversity mean? It means basically the diversity, so variation, all of the different things and species that are biological. So, as opposed to geological. Yeah. Yes. You have a question?
How do crayfish dig holes?
How do they dig holes? Faster than you would think, but pretty slow. So they just use all those little legs and those claws to just start excavating and pushing. Not quite like that, but they're going to kind of try to push. They're almost shoveling up, right? Yeah, sort of shoveling upwards. Yep, probably like that. Huh? It's not fast. Well, define fast. So this is philosophical. Let's get into a philosophical argument here. What do you think fast versus slow? Yeah. How long do you think it would take you to dig a hole that is probably 10 times your body length and basically maybe not much wider than you? So just digging straight home. Yeah, we can give you little hard parts, like little spade, like tiny little shovels, little spades. 2 years? Yeah. So fast but slow, right? I mean, that's not your entire lifetime. So that's just slow? Okay. See, philosophically, we could argue. Is that fast or slow? All right. I'm actually going to jump because I know we're here, I'm going to jump to the next question because this is kind of cool. So really what I was trying to get at was we have situations where kind of non-native crayfishes have been introduced onto the landscape potentially, but we don't know in sometimes, like we just don't know. Perhaps we haven't sampled thoroughly enough, right? We still don't know the greater biodiversity of crayfishes in this area. I could also just say diversity, and that works too. right? There's a lot left to learn. This is kind of my go-to. How many species of crayfish do you think are in North Carolina that are described? Described, names right now. Anybody want to take a guess? Yes. 2,000 million, that is a lot. I have not been working that hard. There are 51, so there are 51, but we think we're going to come close to doubling that, just based on kind of what we discovered, right? Don't hold me to that, but yes, maybe around 102. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so there is a lot out there, kind of literally in our backyards, that's left to discover, right? Or we've discovered it, it's just we need to describe it, right? To actually formalize it so that it can be conserved and managed. Okay, but what about actual non-native species that we know are having major impacts? So this is kind of this twist on, okay, right? Introduce species when they become invasive, so when they've established, they've spread, and they're having negative impacts on these native ecosystems, that's bad, right? It is. And what can we do? Why is that bad? They're having negative impacts on things like fish, and so let's say you have a whole bunch of crayfishes that aren't native, that are kind of becoming very, very dense in their population, and they're eating all of the insects in that area. And then fish don't have anything to eat. So now the fish start dying because they don't have any food, right? And then what happens is the mammals and the birds that rely on the fish as food, they start having to go elsewhere. Yeah, so typically invasive species, not even typically, it just basically means that they are having negative impacts on these ecosystems. And red swamp crayfish is that for us. Okay, and this is the one that we typically eat. So if you guys go to a seafood shop and they say, native, not always native, just basically live crayfish, like crayfish boil, it's going to be red swamp crayfish. And if you do that, definitely have your boil, but do not release any of these live out into kind of the waters here. They do not belong here. And in fact, they've had some major impacts in areas of North Carolina and South Carolina. They've kind of run out some of the native crayfish species and such. But this is an interesting situation. Have any of you guys been to Murky Island National Wildlife Refuge? If you're big birders, you will have. But this is sort of way the heck out on kind of the outer banks, kind of Curator Sound. It's an amazing place. Well, it's sort of a hot spot for king rail populations. So king rails are near threatened. There was a point several decades ago where their populations were taking a great hit. And so the supervisor of the National Wildlife Refuge decided that she was going to bring in a bunch of red swamp crayfish and dump them into the National Wildlife Refuge to provide kind of food for these king rails. Well, Murky Island National Wildlife Refuge now has one of the largest breeding populations of king rails ever, anywhere, right? So there's a king rail, right? Pretty cool bird. And why? In part because its major food item now is red swamp crayfish, which is, I know he left, but the highest density of crayfishes that I've ever collected is we threw out a meter quadrat sort of square, and I think we kicked that square into a net and stopped counting at 600 crayfish. So just a little square area. So they are thick. And we have not been able to find any native crayfishes in that area as well. And they've been spreading outwards, as you can imagine. Sort of these things are not staying put in the little ponds and the canals that they're there. So what do we do? Well, in some cases, or many cases like this, there's nothing we can do, right? I mean, so, okay, how do we eradicate sort of invasive species, invasive species without taking out so much else, right? Or in this case, when it is actually providing kind of that ecological foundation for something that I think people care about a little more than they do crayfish, right? With the king rails, these birds, we do nothing. So how does this come back around to the project? And then we'll get to your questions. How does this come back around to this project that we're doing? how do we think about conservation for crayfishes, but also maybe more generally, right, for freshwater aquatic ecosystems? Well, one of the things is sort of being able to identify what's native versus not native. Really, I think that we're doing the right thing. We're taking this big landscape approach, putting a lot of effort into basically just hammering the landscape to try to figure out what is there and what are the threats, right? So that's super cool. And doing this in such a large collaborative team, so working directly with the agency folks, working with a bunch of university folks, trying to bring in volunteers, trying to get the public involved, and invested in this, kind of allows us to really kind of assess conservation concerns and strategies in real time, right? And get buy-in and say, this is why this is important. And it doesn't just affect crayfishes, right? So what we're doing, a lot of the threats that we're kind of, that we're defining are also impacting fishes and mussels and insects and isopods and amphipods and worms and all these other things that not many people study, but they're out there. And they're these critical components of these aquatic ecosystems. So I like this Winnie the Pooh thing because it is hard. We've put a lot of work in the almost 11 years that I've been here, and we've described sort of several species from North Carolina and beyond, but it seems like a drop in the bucket for what we know is there. And that is going to speed up given kind of how we're now starting to run and change these projects that we're working on. So stay tuned on that front. But I think it's important to realize that kind of those who came before me that really set the foundation for how we understand what crayfish species are, what's happening, have really kind of smoothed the path for where we're going, and to do it kind of in a hopefully expedited manner. And with that said, thank you all for being crayfish interested.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. Fun stuff. Amazing, engaging, compelling. We've got time now for the formal Q&A section. If you've got more questions, I'll actually pass a microphone around. That'll help everybody in the room and watching online make sure that we can hear for the last part of our show. I see your hand up, but other hands can go up as well. And I'm watching the chat online. You can type your questions into the chat, and I'll read them off into the program. Let's come over here.
Do crayfish lay eggs?
So yes, they do, but guess what? They actually lay them onto their abdomen, so their stomach, the bottom underside of their tail. So when you see a female that has eggs, she's brooding the eggs, we call that female in-berry. So 2 words, she's in-berry, like little blueberries, right? And so she'll fan and basically fan those eggs to make sure they're getting oxygen, and she's kind of she's protecting them, and they will actually hatch out kind of from the underside of her tail, and they'll kind of hang on for a while, and then they start molting, right? Each molt, they grow. It's the only way that they can actually expand inside is to shed that exoskeleton, that outer skeleton that they have. And then as they grow a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger, they'll start to foray out away from their mother, and then something comes along, they'll go right back under, then foray out, back under, and then at some point, they're on their own. Yes. It's very cool.
So a question from the internet. Are there citizen science opportunities for studying crayfish or helping us understand diversity?
That is an excellent question, and I think the answer is largely no, although we would love to have citizen science or citizen input. I think the thing that has really kind of stopped us from making that step is that even we as experts are really struggling to be able to identify a lot of these crayfishes. So until we kind of really hammer out, this is this, and this is how you can identify it, it's hard to have, other folks jump in.
Makes a lot of sense. I was thinking platforms like iNaturalist that lots of people use to identify and record observations of wildlife with crayfish doesn't seem like it would work very well. If there's 51 species in North Carolina and half of them are brown with some stripes, I think it could get a little tricky.
Yeah, and a lot of the really informative characters are not typically the ones that most people are going to post on iNat as well. So kind of, yeah, just that, you know, as I showed kind of early on, just looking at the color pattern, that dorsal, that back kind of pattern really only gets us so far for a lot of these species.
Yeah, I noticed in one of the photos, it looked like you had flipped the crayfish upside down and you had a little magnifier and you were looking real close at the bottom of that crayfish. I assumed to try to understand what species it was or what it was doing.
Yeah, so that was actually Tiffany Penland with Georgia DNR, sort of not me. I'm the one's my phone in her face going, oh, this is cool. But yes, that's exactly it. She had it sort of flipped over and we were looking at kind of probably the boy parts, basically, which have been historically used to help identify these species. But we're finding those aren't as important as they used to be. So that's another thing that as we're kind of, again, using this integrative, these multi-data, you know, genetics with morphology and behavior and biogeography, all this stuff together, we're actually able to take a step back and say, hey, the folks that actually created these keys, you know, that to identify these crayfishes, they did a great job for that point, but not all these characters are actually useful anymore. So we're redefining what characters we can look at. So we kind of have to take that 100-mile view. So it's a lot more than just saying, oh, this differs by this, differs by this. We're like, oh man, these 5 species all have this same critical character. Now what do we do?
So it sounds like pretty exciting work to get to do.
And
that not many folks have been doing, and so the field's kind of wide open for exploration.
It is at this scale. So one of the things that we're doing differently, I think there's been a lot of interest in crayfish taxonomy throughout kind of the last several decades, but it's been kind of the old school, what you could think of, you know, somebody driving around a pretty, you know, like, ooh, here's a pretty creek, a pretty river, pull over, grab a crayfish, say, this looks different, you know, sample a little bit. I'm the queen of large, complicated projects, at least designing and starting them. I didn't say they're finishing them. That's something I'm working on. But I think that the way that we are tackling things at these big landscape scales is very novel to what our field is doing. So,
very cool. Another one of our viewers online wants to know if crayfish are solitary or if they live in colonies.
They are not colonies per se. So crayfishes are largely solitary insofar as you'll find one under a rock, not multiples, or kind of one in a burrow, not multiples. But you will find males and females together, or females and their juveniles. And I think this is as we learn more, as we do more field work, we're actually learning that there may be, some of these species are more communal than we thought. So perhaps even some of these burrowing species, if you have these extensive burrows and branching chambers and tunnels and such, that can actually host entire groups.
Fascinating stuff. There was a question too about some of the other negative impacts of the non-native crayfish species.
Yeah, so
like they've pushed out native species, but are there other negative impacts?
I think kind of along the lines of what I was explaining here is that a lot of times, I mean, so non-native does not necessarily mean invasive, right? Those are not going to interchange. I mean, invasive species are non-native, but not all non-native species are invasive, right? So invasive, at that point, like a non-native species can basically persist in an area and have no discernible impacts on anything. When you get to that invasive point, that invasive stage, yes, you have where you have direct competition with native crayfishes, so they're kind of pushing them out. Oftentimes, the best invasive crayfish species are ones that can breed and very, very quickly, faster than most of the natives. So for instance, red swamp crayfish seems to basically kind of go from 0 to, what number did you give me before? Like 200 million billion Easy, I don't, yeah. You know, you can go to like a whole ton in a very short period of time, certainly much faster than the natives do. And so because of that, you get this exponential growth of the invasives and again, they're gonna basically kind of hog the resources that are in play. One of the other kind of interesting things that we've found is that predators of crayfishes, when you have like red swamp crayfish introduced into a system, those predators, you know, they're naive to this. So they may actually still preferentially choose the natives. So not only are the natives being impacted by the invasives, but then the invasives aren't actually being controlled by the predators that would typically kind of eat crayfishes and such. There does get to a point, however, where then, like with the king rails or alligators in Waccamaw, like around Lake Waccamaw, where we found where red swamp crayfishes or red swamp crayfish are the majority of the diet of those. So they're so thick in those canals and in that lake that alligators are just basically able to go, you know, and suck them up.
My gosh.
Reptile, not an amphibian. That one I can get. So.
Last one for you here. What determines how large a crayfish can grow?
Well, so obviously with the Tasmanian giant crayfish, we've got something genetic there that, you know, it's probably not just environment. I mean, that's just much larger than any other crayfish out there, period. However, I think if we're talking about local crayfishes, you can get, it's probably resources, access to resources. So you can have, and I'm thinking of, you know, a species of crayfish when you find it kind of in rivers and streams or in some of its native habitat, you know, maybe the max size is 3 or 4 inches, right? But then you introduce it into, let's say, a reservoir where you've got lots of, it's stocked with fishes and, you know, all sorts of things that maybe has a bunch of nutrient input, algae, things like that. Suddenly that crayfish that elsewhere only gets to a max of 4 inches is basically going to be around 7 or 8. So there's definitely something nutritional. And I do know too from the aquaculture folks that a lot of times, like if we go to a site, or one of my colleagues goes, we go to a site and all we get are these little, we call them peanuts, juveniles, about peanut size. We'll just grab a bunch of those and we can't identify them, you know, without genetics, but we want to know what they are. We want to see what their morphology is. We'll bring them back to this aquaculture center and they basically just feed them. They just shove them full of food and they molt like crazy and they'll grow really fast. So that doesn't mean that you'll get past that terminal size with feeding them really fast, but you'll grow faster.
Fascinating stuff. Let's give Dr. Williams one more round of applause. Thank you very much. Everything you ever wanted to know about crayfish and more. And there's more knowledge to be had, more to be learned. Thanks, everybody, for coming out to the museum today, for participating in our program. We'll be back here again next Wednesday at noon here in the Daily Planet Theater and online with Dr. Kelly Oden. We're going to be talking about spotted lanternflies. They have made it to North Carolina, and we don't like them. So come learn all about them. It'll be a fantastic presentation next Wednesday at noon. I hope we'll see you then. Have a great day, everybody.